welcome everyone back. This is our third episode of our Vodcasts that we are currently running for our consumers and carers. So this is particularly a resource we want to encourage people to use that can't always access our services. So that's for our rural and remote clients, but of course anyone can access these services and these resources. Today we're going to talk to Marc Bryant, and we're talking about carers. So you'll notice our previous podcasts, we concentrated on the individual who's impacted or in recovery from eating disorder. But we want to look at how eating disorders impact those who care for their loved ones who are either recovering or in recovery from an eating disorder. So Marc, there's a term that the literature refers to as compassion fatigue. So it's that fatigue people get when they care for a loved one who's in pain. So I don't know if you've ever thought of that particular concept of carer fatigue that I want us to explore. But maybe if you want to introduce yourself to our viewers and share your story a little bit about how you supported your loved one who's now recovered from an eating disorder.
Thanks, Belinda. I was a primary carer for my daughter for 6 years through her time with an eating disorder. I was a co-carer, but I took the primary role. That was a number of years ago now, and as you said, she's been in recovery, and but it's still a part of our lives in some ways because we remember, and we're all been in a process of rebuilding, I would say, after that.
So Marc, when I talk about carer fatigue, is it something you relate to?
Yes, very much, and it's a very real part of supporting a loved one, and it has a major impact on everybody, including the person that you're caring for.
So when you think back of when the family, the loved one was in the midst of the eating disorder, what and that sort of fatigue kicked in. Can you describe some of, I don't want to use the word symptoms, but you know what I'm saying? What is that manifestation of your fatigue, of how it impacted on your support of the loved one and your relationships with the rest of the family?
Well, probably it's good to start that we were a family of four, the two parents and two children, and our daughter has a younger brother, so he was also part of it, and we are and were a close-knit family.
Yes, you are.
But it's still, the challenge was so much that it pushed the family unit to the limits, I would say. And the fatigue was a major part of that. And unfortunately, the carer fatigue builds in the background, and because you're so focused on your loved one and the task at hand, it's not something that's obvious, but it builds and builds, and unfortunately, when it reaches a crisis level, that's when you start to see the characteristics. I suspect the characteristics are different for everyone, but there are some common ones, obviously, and just a sense of overwhelming frustration and a sense of not accomplishing or being able to help your loved one. You're not seeing any change, you're not seeing any progress. And then you've got the physical element too, because it's very hard to have good sleep when you're so worried and stressed. And there are time off work or other activities through the day that you've got to sacrifice. So all of that just builds and builds, and it all becomes fatigue. And then, as I said, the characteristics start to show that those are generally a shortness of temper, an intolerance, and they're rarely aimed, although they sometimes do, but they're not so much aimed at the person you're caring for because they're the primary focus. It actually is everyone around you, and unfortunately those nearest to us often take the brunt. So in my case, it was my wife and even our son from time to time. And of course all three of those were showing signs of fatigue, and so it would bounce off each other. And it took many years actually in our time that before we came to really appreciate and understand it, and then started to take control and manage it.
So Marc, you mentioned that you don't actually realise that you're getting burned out or fatigued. So is there something around being aware or self-awareness maybe that you can share with carers now who's just starting on the road of supporting their loved ones? So you were saying, this creeps up on you. Is there anything that you can tell people that's helpful in building awareness around your own resilience?
Yes, well, as I said, it took a few years before we started to understand the nature of this fatigue, and then started to put in some ways of dealing with it. So I think the most important thing is to recognise it exists.
Yes.
And then what it looks like in your family dynamic, and then you develop ways to manage it. The most important thing is to step out of the space, I think.
Okay.
And make sure that you have a regular activity that has little to nothing to do with the eating disorder, and that can be a sport, that could be as simple as going for a walk, sitting and reading a book, spending time with friends. And my experience talking to a lot of carers over the last few years, I come to understand that looks very different for a lot of people, and particularly people who are sole carers in a very small or limited social space or remote areas. That must be really challenging, but it's vital that they plan to have this time. So a key skill would be to make sure that you have a regular planned activity.
Okay.
Once a week.
Yes.
I go for 2 hours and schedule someone to come in and support your loved one if that's what's required, and you go and do this activity completely away from it.
Don't leave it up to chance.
No, because you become so overwhelmed sometimes as the eating disorder ebbs and flows, that you just won't realise it, and you've actually gone a month without doing anything for yourself, and that's too long.
Now, Butterfly, during their May Days campaign, they did a lot of research and they did some surveys, so there were some stats, and the one was that over 80% of carers start struggling with their own mental health. Is that something you relate to? Is that a normal occurrence, or does that only happen to a few carers?
I certainly relate to it, and I would expect that it's a common thing.
Yes.
It's a very unusual and challenging thing to care for someone, because the emotions are so strong and your investment with them is so strong. And of course there's the fear of the unknown, the fear of what's happening. So I think it would be strange not to have those, to have mental health challenges, which makes all the more important to have some way of releasing that.
So if we had examples of mental health challenges, what would you think they could possibly be?
Well, certainly the frustration, as I mentioned earlier, of not seeing any progress, not seeing any change, particularly in the early stages of supporting someone with an eating disorder. It's fundamentally against sort of a normal way of living. And so it's very difficult to understand what's happening. And that frustration can build, and particularly as things can probably get worse before they get better, it just feels like you're getting nowhere, and your loved one's in more and more crisis. So that's a challenge.
It's a cycle of frustration. I'm not seeing movement. I'm getting anxious. Therefore I'm not sleeping. I'm not sleeping, therefore I'm losing my patience. And I know in previous conversations you and I have had, you talked about guilt kicking in.
And that's the other thing, that's underlying. I don't know whether everyone feels that, but certainly most fathers that I've spoken to, and certainly myself, there was a strong undercurrent of guilt that I had. What had I do to cause this? What did I not do as a parent? Should I have seen the signs earlier? Should I changed something? And so all of that, and in a rational state, you can probably deal with that. But you're not necessarily in a rational state because you're so stressed. And so those thoughts do creep in and sit in the background. And they're not valid either, I would want to add. They're not valid.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
These things, who knows exactly how they're all caused, and there's a lot of research going into that. And I know that some recent studies reveal that in fact there is potentially a gene and a genuine medical element to eating disorders. And you know, when I heard that, even though years after in recovery, I still felt a weight lift. And that a sense of, right, okay.
It wasn't all my fault.
And I've shared that information with a few other carers, and I saw the same reaction to them.
And I think we hear that a lot because of our carer team obviously works solely with carers, and there's a lot of that, it's my fault. We've got the blaming the dominant mother or blaming the absent father, and I think a lot of carers struggle with that. And I really liked your point about you can rationalize it, but the heart tells you something different, especially when you're feeling fatigued, you haven't slept, you're feeling slightly depressed. And that's a reassurance I think we want to give people that's listening to us. No, it's not somebody's fault.
Absolutely. It's human nature to seek answers and human nature to understand things and why they happen. And sometimes there is no understanding or reason. It's a collective. And as I've come to know, eating disorders are a combination of many things, many societal things and environmental, and it's definitely not down to one thing or one person, and especially the person who you're supporting. It's not their fault either, and they wouldn't ever choose this. So and coming to understand that and moving past that blame and guilt is quite cathartic. It helps you go forward and renews the energy sometimes.
How did you keep your hope alive?
That's a very good question.
Because it gets so tough and the road is long and it's hard, and I think carers go, I'm scared my child's not going to live through this, going to survive this. What would you tell people might help keeping hope alive?
Well, the strongest source of hope is to see people who have recovered. And that's the first thing, to understand that it's possible and probable, I'd like to think. I think the second and most important thing is about relieving the fatigue and relieving that sense of hopelessness by having breaks and stepping out of the space. I know each time I did that, I was able to come back renewed, and that sense of hopelessness had gone. And thirdly, I kept reminding myself who we were dealing with. You know, you're a beautiful little child, and they're always your kid. They never change. You know, she's 22 now, and but she's still my little girl. And so whenever I felt a bit down or worn out, I would just remind myself.
And I know if you look at the work of Professor Janet Treasure, who works a lot with carers, and she's got a skills book on communication, and actually EDQ runs Fostering Recovery, which is a skills-based workshop, particularly for parents, how to communicate. And one of the big things she talks about is that you're not talking to your child. There's this eating disorder that hijacks this beautiful young person.
Very much.
How did you manage to separate the eating disorder from this beautiful young person that was your loved one?
Well, it didn't happen straight away. I have to admit that for potentially a year or more,
yes,
it was not something that I came to understand, and I struggled to know what was happening. And there's avoidance and there's denial and all the early stages, and moving past those, you just focus on getting them well as you can. And it wasn't until, as I said, some time, I started to understand that in fact the eating disorder is almost as if it's a separate entity, and you've got your child or your loved one there, they're still there, and they're hijacked by this eating disorder. And unfortunately, the eating disorder has control. But once you separate the two, you can start to focus on your loved one.
Yes.
And the eating disorder becomes the bad guy. And you know, the more we did that, the easier it got to blame the disorder as a thing. And we're looking like, and then it became a rescue mission.
Yes.
And the most wonderful thing was, once we started talking in those terms and behaving in those terms, when I say we, I mean the whole family.
Family, yes.
And we actually gave it a name as Ed, and Ed was a pretty bad guy.
Yeah.
And the most amazing thing is that our daughter started to understand that separation too. And she says, even to this day, that was one of the key moments of her recovery, was that she suddenly felt this wasn't all on her.
Fantastic.
It wasn't her to blame. This disorder was something that we could all focus as a bad guy. And I use the description when talking with carers is that we were over here fighting the disorder, and once she separated from it and came around and joined us, its days were numbered.
Yes. It was on the outs. And I think that's why it's so important when we talk about language, that we don't label people with their eating disorder. It's not you are anorexic.
No.
So that makes the externalizing so much easier to say, I'm not binge eater. I am somebody who struggles with this, and I can externalize it, put it over there, and we can actually confront it.
Absolutely.
And do something about it.
Yeah, I couldn't emphasise that point enough, actually, because it's so important. Until everybody in the home or in that space understands that, unfortunately, the person with the disorder is always going to have this enormous guilt and enormous worthlessness, that they don't deserve to get well. They don't deserve to be healed. And they see the damage that the disorder's done, and they see the pain and hurt that's been caused, and that just cycles around and makes them feel all the less worthy of being well. And those were words that our daughter used, was that I don't deserve your love, I don't deserve to be well. How
did you deal with that, Marc?
Well, initially, again, I not raged, but I was almost offended by that.
Yes.
I said, of course you do, and that's just silly.
Yeah.
But as I understood the depth of where that was coming from, and perhaps even the root cause, that's when we started to sort of just keep reminding and demonstrating. And as I said, that separation, actually you do deserve to be loved, and you do deserve a normal life, and you deserve to be well. It's the disorder that doesn't deserve these things.
Yes.
That it's the villain in the story.
Yes.
And once she started to accept and believe that, that was a turning point.
That was a huge turning
point. We saw our daughter come back.
Yes. What a relief.
Yes. Hard to put into words.
Yes, it's a really. So, I often carers say, how long does this take?
And that's one of the more difficult things, is because there is no single answer. Everyone is unique, and therefore everybody's experience with the disorder is unique. But I would say to carers out there that it was remarkable that there were no obvious signs of recovery, and then all of a sudden there was major leaps forward.
Okay. Yeah, so like an exponential kind of
flow
of things.
It definitely wasn't a linear improvement slowly. It was a big leap, and as I said, those those cognitive milestones were the key.
Yes. Were there any particular treatment options that worked well for you? And I know not all treatment works for everyone. So some people really find FBT helpful, others find more psychodynamic approach helpful, or coming to an organisation like ours.
Yes, we, through the course of those 6 years, definitely saw numerous therapists and numerous people just to help, and it eventually simply we came across one that our daughter really connected with.
Okay.
And the moment that happened, there was a change and improvement. So
was that a therapist, like a psychologist?
Yes, it was just a psychologist that would talk to us, but talked with her. And I think that's the key. And perhaps with all sorts of support like that, it's about getting the right person and the one that clicks. And so the only message I would say is keep trying.
Don't stop at the first one.
Absolutely.
The first thing might not work, but this is not the end of the road.
No,
there are options.
That's right. That's right. It's a very individual thing.
Yes.
So just keep engaging. The other major benefit was understanding that you're not alone and that you're not strange. There are many people out there.
Yes.
In this space, and so coming to EDQ and connecting with EDQ carers, and also particularly the facilities like the Fostering Recovery Workshop,
the support group,
just wonderful, because you're not alone.
Yes.
And knowing that, and as I said earlier, understanding that recovery is possible and seeing it, that was another major step forward particularly for our daughter to actually meet someone that had recovered, a living, breathing example.
Lived experience.
Yes.
I think before we wrap this up, one question. A lot of carers talk about the cost of treatment. So we talked about the emotional cost that creates this carer fatigue, but there's also a huge financial cost. We know it's expensive. Our loved ones go into hospital, they have long stays. Fortunately, we've got a little bit of the Medicare rejig of the system. We're hoping that's going to relieve some of that burden of cost. Do you want to speak a little bit to that cost, and maybe were there little nuggets of support that you can share around not just the emotional cost, but also maybe the financial cost?
Well, the hospital stays, and they perhaps are the hardest to really accept. Because it's very traumatic to have your loved one go off to hospital and be admitted.
Yes.
Particularly in the medical circumstance, to stabilise them, and then moving into a mental health facility. For someone who's never been involved with that, it's quite daunting and confronting.
Yes.
And a lot of stigma and social concepts are there as well, so you have to deal with that straight away. But they generally, if that point comes along, that is generally the best thing that happens.
Yes.
Because you know that they're being cared for, they're being looked after, and
keeping them safe.
Keeping them safe, and unfortunately, multiple stays, and that's a bit confronting to hear. But multiple stays is common, but it's all part of that process, and. It's not always, but that's sometimes the case. And you have to have that courage to go ahead with that. I know I struggled with that. I just desperately didn't want that to be a reality. Yes. But looking back now, it was impossible to come through without that, so that was important. The public health system here in Brisbane.
Yeah, we've got the Royal Brisbane.
Yes, that was what we actually used, and I have to say it was remarkable. The level of compassion and understanding with the staff was quite really high.
Good. Yeah,
it was quite high. And again, you brace yourself for that sort of misunderstandings and stigma everywhere, and it's just not the case. And in fact, later in years, I've been quite vocal and outspoken, both in my work group, in my social networks, because I want people to understand this. I want to break down those barriers and stigma, and and help particularly people who are out there who are quietly dealing with this.
Do you think the Medicare rebate is going to be helpful? Because now we're going to have special number and it's going to be the 40 sessions with dietetics. Do you think that will help with the cost?
Absolutely. It's something that everyone should look into using.
Yes.
We also used the option to take out a mental health plan.
Okay, yes.
And not just for our daughter, but actually myself and my wife took them out.
Great idea.
Because it was legitimate, in fact, because it was our mental health under stress as well. And what it enabled us was then to access, I believe it was 10 free sessions.
Yes.
So as we were seeing that psychologist, we actually had 30 sessions that were free.
Yes, between the three of you.
Because the three of us were coming to the psychologist sessions, and it was legitimate to do that. And that helped a great deal in financial.
That is a really good idea, yes. And that so that you can get a mental health plan referral through your GP. And at EDQ we actually have Medicare practitioners who work under that scheme. So Marc, before we wrap up, any last minute information you want to share? A giveaway message or takeaway message for people who may be sitting remote, rural, as to what they possibly can do to support their loved ones, whether it's a younger person or their partner or
only to say that you're doing a great job. Just simply being there and stepping up into that carer role is a wonderful thing, and something that you should be proud of. And you might feel like you're not doing a great job, you might feel like there's so much more you could be doing, but you already are. And look after yourself, it's important.
Yes.
We use the metaphor that in an aeroplane situation when there's an issue, they always say put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on your children. Well, it's the same thing. You can't be the best carer if you don't look after yourself. So take those times, schedule some opportunities to go out and enjoy, whether it's a walk, a swim, a coffee with friends. You'll be better for it.
And I like what you were saying there. You see your loved one, not the eating disorder, and to remember that there is that person that you've loved. They're still there.
Absolutely, they are. They might be gagged and their hands and feet are tied in the cellar and they rarely get to come out, but they're there and they appreciate and love everything that you're doing, even if they don't express it, because the eating disorder is the one that's controlling their words and their behaviour. Rest assured they're really in there, and they appreciate everything that you're doing, and one day they'll tell you when they come out of it.
Thank you so much, Marc, for
My
sharing
pleasure.
your story with us. Just a reminder, we've got episode 1 and 2, particularly for our individuals who are struggling with an eating disorder. So please go on to our YouTube channel or also on our website under the resource tab to listen to those too. All of them have got a downloadable PDF, a resource that you can use during times of struggle.